Sophie Taylor pulled her coat tighter around her as she stepped off the bus, the chilly autumn wind biting at her skin. The town of Ashford, a sleepy little place tucked away in the mountains, was supposed to be her weekend escape, the kind of small town where time seemed to stand still, where the world moved slowly, and where a journalist like Sophie could take a break from the constant buzz of city life. But Sophie hadn't come to Ashford for a vacation. She had come because of the rumors, the stories that had surfaced about people going missing without a trace, stories that had gone largely ignored by the media. Local authorities hadn't made much of the disappearances, and the few reports that had made their way into the local paper were quickly dismissed. But Sophie had a gut feeling that something was wrong in Ashford, and she was determined to find out what. Beside her, Max, her loyal German shepherd, trotted silently, his eyes scanning the streets for anything out of place. Sophie had adopted Max after he'd been retired from the police force, and together they had built a strong partnership. He was her constant companion, her protector, and her confidant. Max's keen instincts often picked up things that Sophie couldn't, like the low growl that rumbled in his chest as they passed the town's empty square. "Easy, boy," Sophie murmured, rubbing the back of Max's neck. She'd learned to trust him in situations like this. When something didn't feel right, Max was usually the first to notice. The small town of Ashford had an eerie stillness to it. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet for a Saturday afternoon. Sophie had expected more life in the town square, but there were only a few locals sitting on benches, talking in hushed voices, their eyes darting nervously as she walked past. She'd been in Ashford for less than an hour, and already she could feel the weight of the town's secrets pressing down on her. Sophie had made arrangements to meet with a local contact, a woman named Sarah Walters, who had been the one to leak the first details about the missing people. Sophie had been skeptical at first, but Sarah's email had been chilling enough to warrant a visit. "I'll be at the cafe by the library," Sarah's message had said. "Come alone. It's not safe to talk on the phone." Sophie glanced at Max. He had always been her backup, but in a town like this she wasn't sure how much help he would be. Still, she wasn't going to leave him behind. Max's ears perked up as they neared the cafe. Sophie felt a strange unease settle over her as she pushed open the door. The bell above the door chimed, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. A few patrons sat at small tables, their conversations muted by the soft music playing in the background. In the far corner, a woman waved. Sophie spotted her immediately. Sarah Walters, the woman who had reached out to her. She was sitting, alone, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of coffee. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and restless. Sophie approached her table, and Sarah stood up as soon as she saw Sophie. "Thanks for meeting me," Sarah said in a low voice, glancing around nervously as she sat back down. "I wasn't sure if you'd come. You're the first journalist who's actually paid attention to what's been happening here." Sophie took a seat across from Sarah, her notepad ready. "You said there were disappearances. Can you tell me more?" Sarah hesitated, looking over her shoulder before she spoke. "It's not just disappearances, Sophie. It's like people are vanishing. One day they're here, and the next it's like they were never part of this town at all." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, vanishing? Are there no bodies? No evidence?" Sarah's face went pale. "That's the thing. There's no evidence. No bodies. It's like they just disappear. It started a few months ago. At first it was just one or two people, loners, people who didn't have many friends. But lately it's been happening more often, and no one's talking about it. The town's covering it up." Sophie scribbled notes quickly. "Why would they cover it up, and who's doing it?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "But I've been hearing things, strange things. People talking about an organization, some group that's been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. It's all hush-hush, but I'm telling you, it's not just bad luck or coincidence. They're taking people. Sophie's heart began to race. This was bigger than she had imagined. But what kind of group could be behind such a thing? And why Ashford, a small, seemingly innocuous town? "Do you have any proof?" Sophie asked. "Anything concrete?" Sarah's eyes darted around the cafe and she leaned in close. "I do, but it's dangerous. If I show you, they'll know. And once they know, they'll come after me. They've already been watching me." Max growled lowly at the mention of danger. Sophie looked down at him. His instincts were on high alert, his body tense. Sophie knew that Max could sense when things weren't right, and right now, everything about this situation felt wrong. "Don't worry," Sophie said, rubbing Max's ears. "We're in this together. You can trust me." For a moment, Sarah seemed to hesitate, but then she pulled a small envelope from her bag and slid it across the table to Sophie. "This is a list of names," Sarah whispered. "People who've gone missing, but it's more than that. These are people who were connected to something dark. The list includes old town officials, people who were part of Ashford's history. I think they're all connected." Sophie opened the envelope slowly, careful not to draw attention. Inside was a list of names, all written in neat handwriting, with dates next to them. The most recent disappearance was only a few days ago. Sarah had been right. This was getting worse. Max's growl deepened as he glanced out the window, his gaze fixed on a figure standing in the distance. Sophie followed his line of sight, her stomach tightening as she recognized the man, Sheriff Mitchell, the town's head lawman. He was watching them from across the street, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," Sophie whispered, her heart racing. "We need to go. Now." Before Sarah could respond, Max stood and began to bark urgently, his stance protective. "We've been made," Sophie said, her voice low but urgent. "Come on." Sophie grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door, Max leading the way, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. As they rushed out of the cafe, Sophie could hear the sound of footsteps behind them, fast and heavy. "Don't look back," Sophie muttered to Sarah. "Just keep moving," Max barked. Again, and Sophie felt a surge of adrenaline. This was no longer just an investigation. It was survival. Sophie and Sarah moved swiftly down the narrow alley, the sound of Max's paws tapping against the wet pavement, the only sound breaking the eerie silence that had descended upon Ashford. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. As they turned the corner, avoiding the main street where Sheriff Mitchell and his deputies would certainly be looking for them, Max, his fur bristling, led the way, his ears flicking with every noise in the distance. Sophie's hand gripped Sarah's wrist tightly as she urged her to move faster. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice strained with panic. "We need to get out of sight," Sophie said, her breath coming in quick bursts. "I know a place not far from here. We can lay low for a while and figure out our next move." Sophie didn't know if it was the right decision, but she couldn't afford to get caught now. The envelope Sarah had handed her wasn't just a list of missing people. It was a potential map to the heart of whatever sinister thing was happening in Ashford. Whoever was behind the disappearances had to be stopped, but now it felt like the clock was ticking. They reached the side of an old brick building, a former warehouse that had been abandoned for years. The entrance was dark and barely noticeable, a metal door tucked in a corner behind a stack of old crates. Sophie pushed the door open and ushered Sarah inside. Max was already ahead of them, sniffing the air as he paced restlessly in the dim light of the alley. "Stay close," Sophie said to Sarah, her voice sharp but calm. "This place should keep us off their radar for a while." Sarah nodded, but didn't speak. Her eyes were wide with fear, and Sophie could see the weight of the situation settling over her. Once inside, Sophie closed the door and leaned against it, taking a moment to catch her breath. Max stood still, his gaze fixed on the darkness ahead, his body still tense. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do next?" Sophie looked down at the envelope in her hands, the list of names staring back at her. There were more than a dozen names, all with dates next to them. As she flipped through the list, she felt the weight of the information pressing down on her. The most recent disappearance had occurred just 3 days ago, the day she'd arrived in Ashford. "Now," Sophie said, "we figure out what's really going on here." Max growled softly, and Sophie glanced up, her instincts alert. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere outside. It was faint, but unmistakable. "They're looking for us," Sophie said, her voice low. "We can't stay here for long." She glanced around the warehouse. It wasn't much, just a large empty space filled with old crates and dust, but it would provide some cover, at least for now. Sophie turned to Sarah, her eyes narrowing. "I need you to tell me everything," Sophie said, her voice sharp with urgency. "Everything you know about these people, about what's happening in Ashford. We don't have much time." Sarah swallowed hard, her hands shaking. She glanced nervously toward the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. I don't know much more than what I've already told you," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "But I've heard things, whispers really, people saying there's a group, some kind of organization, that's been pulling strings in this town for years. I don't know who they are or what they want, but they're the ones behind all of this. The disappearances, the strange behavior of the townspeople." Sophie frowned. "Why hasn't anyone gone public? Why aren't the police doing anything?" "They're part of it," Sarah whispered. "At least some of them are. Sheriff Mitchell, I think. He's the one who's been covering it all up. People who get too close to the truth, people like me, just disappear. It's like they've got their hands in everything. The local government, the businesses, the schools, they control it all." Sophie rubbed her temples, trying to process what Sarah was saying. If what Sarah was telling her was true, then the conspiracy in Ashford went deeper than she had imagined. This wasn't just about a few missing people. It was about an entire town, a system of control that had been in place for years. But why? And what did they want with these people? Sophie's mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was certain. If she wanted to get to the bottom of this, she was going to have to confront the heart of the mystery. And that meant going up against whoever was in charge. Max's growl broke through her thoughts again, his body tense as he lifted his head toward the back of the warehouse. Sophie held up her hand to silence Sarah, motioning for her to stay quiet. Another set of footsteps, closer this time. Sophie's pulse quickened. "They're here," she whispered. Sarah's face went pale. "What do we do?" "We can't let them." "Find us." Sophie glanced around quickly. There was a narrow staircase leading up to a catwalk above them, an old route for warehouse workers back when the building had been in use. It was their best option. "Up there," Sophie said, pointing to the stairs. "Quickly!" Max darted ahead, his paws echoing against the metal as he raced up the steps. Sophie grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the staircase. They moved as quietly as possible, but the sound of boots on gravel grew louder with every passing second. They reached the catwalk, and Sophie pulled Sarah into a small alcove behind a rusted support beam. Max lay down at their feet, his eyes trained on the entrance below. From their vantage point, Sophie could see the dim outline of 2 figures entering the warehouse. Sheriff Mitchell and another man, his face obscured by a hat. They moved slowly, cautiously scanning the area. Sophie held her breath, praying they wouldn't look up. "What do we do now?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Sophie clenched her fists, her mind spinning with options. But one thing was clear, they couldn't stay hidden forever. If they were going to uncover the truth and stop whatever was happening in Ashford, they needed to act. And they needed to act fast. "We wait for the right moment," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Then we make our move." Sophie's heart pounded as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. She could hear her own breath, ragged and shallow, as she kept her gaze fixed on the 2 figures below. The sheriff and the man with him were speaking in low, hushed tones, but Sophie couldn't make out the words. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to act, but she stayed still. Every muscle in her body was taut, ready to spring into action. But she knew that if they were caught now, everything would be over. Max lay beside them, his body stiff, eyes fixed on the men below. The German shepherd's ears were alert, but his training kept him perfectly still. Sophie had never been more thankful for his calm presence. If Max panicked, they'd all be in trouble. Sheriff Mitchell stopped near the far end of the warehouse. His head tilted slightly, as though he were listening for something. The other man, shorter and stockier, turned in a slow circle, scanning the room. Sophie held her breath, pressing herself back into the shadows, hoping they wouldn't think to look up. "Where are they?" the sheriff muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for Sophie to hear. The man next to him shrugged. "They've got to be somewhere in here. There's nowhere else for them to go. They've got the list." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The list. Her mind raced. The envelope Sarah had given her, the names of missing people, was the key to everything. Whoever was behind the disappearances had been tracking people, and it was clear they didn't want that list getting out. Sarah glanced nervously at Sophie. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What are we going to do?" she whispered urgently. Sophie's mind spun. They couldn't stay hidden forever, but rushing into a confrontation with the sheriff wasn't the best idea. He was too powerful. The man with him, though, that was a different story. Sophie didn't know who he was, but he didn't look like a local. Maybe he was part of the conspiracy. Maybe he was someone she could get information from. She leaned close to Sarah, her voice barely audible. "We need to find out who that man is. He's the one we need to focus on. If we can figure out who he is, we might be able to uncover what's really going on here." Sarah nodded, though she looked more anxious than ever. "But how?" Sophie's eyes flicked over to the catwalk. The shadows were thick, and if they moved quickly enough, they could circle around to the other side of the warehouse without being seen. There was a small maintenance door on the far side that led to the back alley. It was risky, but it was their best chance. "We wait for them to move toward the other side," Sophie whispered. "Then we make a break for it." Max gave a low growl as though he understood the plan. Sophie held her breath, waiting for the right moment. The men below were still talking in low voices, but Sophie could see them starting to move toward the far corner of the warehouse. The sheriff glanced up briefly, but his eyes never reached the catwalk. It was now or never. Sophie gave Sarah a silent nod, and the two of them crept toward the edge of the catwalk, moving as silently as possible. Max was right behind them, his paws making only the softest sound on the metal. They reached the staircase, and Sophie looked over the railing. One last time. The sheriff and his companion were too far across the room now to notice them. Sophie motioned for Sarah to follow her, and they quickly descended the stairs. Max led the way, his senses sharp. The small maintenance door was only a few feet away, and Sophie could already taste the cool night air on the other side. But as she reached for the handle, the door swung open. Too fast, too suddenly, and a figure stepped into the warehouse. It was the man. Sophie's heart stopped. He was taller than she had expected, with dark, curly hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through the dim light of the warehouse. His face was hard, like stone, but there was a cold calculation in his gaze. He was holding something small, hidden in the palm of his hand. "Not so fast," the man said, his voice low and steady. Sophie's pulse quickened. There was no way out. She couldn't move fast enough to outrun him and the sheriff. "Would be back soon." Max growled from behind her, his teeth bared, and Sophie felt the tension in his body as he stood ready to defend them. The man's eyes flicked to Max, a slight smirk tugging at his lips. "A good dog," he said, almost amused, "but it won't save you." "Who are you?" Sophie demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked her up and down, sizing her up. Then, with a tilt of his head, he said, "I'm someone who can make sure you never leave this town." Sophie's throat tightened. She had no choice now. She was trapped, but she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She couldn't. "I know what you're doing here," she said, trying to sound confident, though every instinct told her she was walking into a trap. "You've been taking people, disappearing them, and I'm going to find out why." The man's expression darkened. The faint smirk disappeared. "You really don't know, do you?" he asked, his voice colder now. Sophie's heart skipped. "What did he mean by that?" "I know more than you think," she retorted, though her stomach churned with uncertainty. For a moment, the man didn't speak. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots clanking loudly on the concrete floor. Max stood his ground, his growl deepening. Then, just as Sophie thought he was about to make his move, the man stopped, his face softening slightly. "You're too late," he said, his voice almost sympathetic. "You're already part of the game." Before Sophie could respond, there was a sharp sound behind her, the unmistakable sound of a door slamming open. Sheriff Mitchell. And the game had just begun. Sophie's heart raced as she turned to face the sheriff, his heavy footsteps echoing through the warehouse. Max's low growl grew louder, a clear warning that he wasn't backing down, but Sophie knew they were outnumbered. The sheriff's presence, coupled with the unknown man's cold, calculating stare, put her in a corner. "Sheriff," the man said, his voice smooth and almost mocking, "it seems we've caught a couple of spies." Sophie felt Sarah's breath quicken beside her, her body tense as if ready to bolt at any moment. But Sophie wasn't going to let fear take control. Not now, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. "Step away from the door," the sheriff commanded, his voice gruff as he approached, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "This is a serious situation. You're both involved in something much bigger than you realize." "Bigger than a handful of missing people?" Sophie shot back, her voice firmer than she felt. "What's going on here, Sheriff? You're covering it up, aren't you?" The sheriff's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening. He didn't respond immediately, but Sophie could feel the tension building. The man at his side stepped closer, his eyes flicking from Sophie to Sarah and then to Max, who was still standing protectively in front of Sophie. "Let's get something clear, Miss Bennett," the sheriff said, his tone suddenly icy. "You're in over your head. If you know what's good for you, you'll walk away and forget everything you've seen here tonight." Sophie swallowed hard, trying to keep her cool despite the fear that threatened to rise in her chest. She had no intention of backing down. There was too much at stake. The missing people, the mysterious disappearances, the strange happenings in Ashford. She couldn't just walk away, not when she was so close to the truth. "I don't think I'll be walking away, Sheriff," Sophie said, her voice steady. "Not when I know what you've been hiding. People are disappearing in this town, and you're part of it. I don't care who you're protecting or why. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what's going on here." The sheriff's gaze flicked to the man beside him, a subtle gesture, but Sophie caught it. The man stepped forward, his hand tightening around the small object he'd been holding earlier. Sophie's instincts screamed at her. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a standoff. "Do you really think you can stop us?" The man asked, his voice low and almost amused. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Sophie took a step back, her mind racing. She needed a way out. She needed to get Sarah and Max to safety, to get the information they had to someone who could stop this. She couldn't let them intimidate her, not now. "Max," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the man's. "Stay close." Max's eyes glowed in the dim light, his body tense and ready to act. Sophie reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers brushing against the small recorder she had hidden there. If she could get a recording of their conversation, it would be proof of what was happening. She needed to buy herself more time. The sheriff stepped forward again, his hand moving toward his gun. Sophie's heart skipped. This wasn't going the way she'd hoped. "I'll give you one last chance, Sophie," the sheriff said, his voice colder now. "Walk away. or things will get ugly." Sophie didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back, positioning herself closer to the shadows of the warehouse. If they were going to fight their way out, she needed to be prepared. She kept her eyes on the sheriff, watching for any movement. Max growled again, the low rumble vibrating in Sophie's chest. The man smirked, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "I'm not afraid of you," Sophie said, trying to sound confident, though her heart was racing. "You should be," the man replied. "You have no idea who you're really dealing with." Sophie felt her breath catch. There was something about his words, something that told her this wasn't just a local conspiracy anymore. Whoever they were dealing with, it was much bigger, much more dangerous than just Ashford. The sheriff's eyes flicked toward the door, as if waiting for something, and that was when Sophie realized the other side of the warehouse was still, wide open. The men hadn't closed it. It was the perfect opportunity. "Sophie," Sarah whispered urgently, "we need to go, now." Sophie glanced back at Sarah. She could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her jacket. But Sophie couldn't afford to be scared. Not now. She was too close. "Not yet," Sophie said, her voice firm. Max gave a sudden sharp bark, and the two men immediately turned toward the sound. Sophie didn't waste a second. She grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the maintenance door, but as they reached for the handle, the man rushed forward, blocking their way. "Not so fast," he said, grabbing Sophie by the arm. His grip was like iron. Before Sophie could react, Max lunged at the man, his teeth bared. The man stumbled back, shocked by the sudden attack, but he quickly regained his composure, shoving Max away with a growl. "Get off me, you damn mutt!" The man snarled. Sophie's heart pounded as she yanked the door open, urging Sarah to move through. "Go! Now!" Sarah hesitated, but Sophie's urgency was enough to push her forward. They ran into the cold night air, the sound of their footsteps, muffled by the thick snow on the ground. Max followed them quickly, his body tense, still ready to protect them at a moment's notice. Behind them they heard shouting, the heavy boots of the sheriff and his companion following close behind. Sophie didn't look back. They had no time to lose. They reached the end of the alley, and Sophie's breath came in ragged gasps. They had to keep moving, keep running. They couldn't let them catch them, but as they turned the corner, Sophie's blood ran cold. Ahead, standing under the street lamp, was another figure, a man with a gun. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest as the figure in front of them stepped into the dim light of the street lamp. The gun in his hand gleamed in the snow, a silent promise of violence. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no escape. "Stop right there," the man said, his voice cold and commanding. His eyes narrowed as he sized up Sophie, Sarah, and Max. Sophie could see the determination in his stance, his feet planted firmly in the snow, blocking their only path. Max, always protective, growled low in his throat, his hackles raised. Sophie's hand instinctively moved to his collar, trying to calm him, but she knew this wasn't a situation that could be diffused with words or gestures. It was too far gone. "Sophie," Sarah whispered, fear evident in her voice. "What do we do?" Sophie took a step forward, her mind racing. She couldn't let them get away with this. She had the evidence, the recordings, the notes, everything she needed to bring them down. But right now, it was about survival. They had to make it out. Alive first. The man with the gun didn't flinch. "I suggest you turn around and go back inside," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "You're not going to make it very far out here." "You don't scare me," Sophie said, her voice steady, even though her pulse was pounding in her ears. She wasn't sure if it was defiance or desperation that kept her feet planted. "You're working with them, aren't you? The sheriff, the disappearances, this whole town is part of your little scheme. What is it, human trafficking, organ harvesting? What are you doing?" The man's eyes narrowed even further, his lips curling into a tight, humorless smile. "You think you know something, don't you? But you don't. You're out of your depth, Miss Bennett. You think this is some small-town conspiracy. This is bigger than you can imagine. You've got no idea what you've stumbled into." Sophie felt a wave of cold dread, but she stood her ground. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her, not after everything she'd uncovered. "I know more than you think," Sophie replied, her voice sharp. "I have evidence, and I'm going to make sure the world knows what's really happening here." "You won't get away with it." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You don't get it, do you? You're already a part of this now. There's no going back. If you don't walk away now, you're going to be just another name on the list of people who disappeared." Max growled louder, his body tense, ready to spring into action. Sophie reached for his collar again, but her eyes never left the man. She had to act fast. There was no room for negotiation. No more time to reason with him. This was it. She stepped forward, her hand still on Max's collar, but she kept her eyes on the gun. "I'm not walking away," Sophie said, her voice unwavering. "And neither are you." In the split second that followed, everything moved in slow motion. Sophie felt Sarah pull at her sleeve, trying to get her to retreat, but Sophie knew they didn't have that luxury anymore. The man raised his gun, aiming it at them with deliberate precision. Max reacted first. With a low, terrifying growl, he launched himself at the man, his powerful muscles propelling him forward like a missile. The man barely had time to react before Max knocked him off balance, sending the gun flying from his hands. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Max had just saved them. The man hit the snow with a heavy thud, grunting in surprise and pain as Max pinned him to the ground, his jaws bared. The cold, harsh reality of the situation set in. This was the moment where everything could change. Sophie could either escape or make sure this man didn't get up to continue his dangerous mission. Without hesitation, Sophie reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the recorder she had been holding onto since the warehouse. The evidence, the proof that could bring everything crashing down. She pointed it toward the man, her fingers trembling, but her voice was steady as she spoke into the recorder. "I have the evidence. I know what you've been doing. You're finished. You're going to prison." The man snarled, struggling beneath Max's weight. "You don't understand." He spat, his breath coming in harsh, angry bursts. "This isn't over. You can't stop what's already in motion. You can't save anyone." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "I already have." She turned to Sarah. "Get to the car, now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran toward the parked car, a few yards away, and Max stayed with Sophie, watching the man with intense focus. Sophie knew they couldn't wait around much longer. This wasn't the only person involved in the conspiracy, but the man's capture was a victory, and it would be enough to take down the whole operation. When she got the recording to the authorities, there would be no turning back. Max's growl softened as the man finally stopped struggling beneath him. Sophie took a deep breath and motioned for Max to back away. He didn't need to be told twice. The German shepherd stepped off the man, watching him carefully. "Get up," Sophie said, her voice cold. "You're coming with me." The man struggled to his feet, his face twisted with rage. Sophie could see the fear in his eyes now, the knowledge that everything was falling apart. The sheriff, the others, they couldn't protect him anymore. Sophie turned toward the car, her grip still firm on Max's collar. "Let's go!" As they walked away, Sophie's mind raced. This was far from over, but it was a start. There were still people to save, still more to uncover. But for the first time, Sophie felt like they had a chance. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. As the car's engine roared to life and the snowstorm swallowed them up, Sophie glanced back at the dark streets of Ashford. The town that had hidden its secrets for so long was about to face the truth, and Sophie would make sure of it. Max nudged her hand, as if to say, "We've got this." And with that, they drove off into the unknown, ready to bring justice to the people of Ashford and expose the conspiracy that had held the town in its grip for far too long.